A host of pubs have banned Labour MPs as a protest over tax changes. Pub landlords are seemingly not happy about the new business rates, and one way of showing their frustration is to bar MPs from the Labour Party. Yet Chancellor Rachel Reeves claimed she supported the British pub and created a tiered business rate, a progressive tax, if you will. 2 weeks ago, Labour Chancellor Rachel Reeves touted her support for the Great British Pub with a tiered system that lowers the multiplier for pubs, among others. Yet, on the same day, a separate agency reassessed valuations for business rates, and these went up. Now, as you can see from this graph, 3 pub chains, Mitchells and Butlers, Marston's, Fuller, Smith and Turner, saw a sharp increase in share prices at the beginning of December and then saw a drop not long after. Of course, you could expect the share prices to increase in this period. It's Christmas, it's the festive season, but then why the fall? Seems odd. Now, despite pubs not being happy with business rates, they have enjoyed an increase in the number of patrons. Big operators said recently that festive bookings were up strongly. Customers are still prepared to splash out for big occasions, despite a general mood of caution in a sluggish economy. Marston said in a recent trading update that bookings for the Christmas period were up 11% year on year, while bigger rival Mitchells and Butlers enjoying an above average of 4.3% like-for-like sales growth so far this year. Reckoned the signs pointed to a cheery end to 2025. Now, despite more sales, pubs are typically a low profit industry. Therefore, any tax changes will be seen as more of a burden compared to businesses that rake in huge profits. But is the British pub dying? And is it really the fault of the government? About a quarter have vanished since 2000. The industry that has, in that time, faced a lackluster economy, a pandemic, a smoking ban, and shifts in drinking habits, while being financially hamstrung by long-term debts secured on properties that were, in some cases, no longer viable as pub habits shifted. Now, I think we need to be talking about the wider issues instead of just taxes. I mean, young people tend to drink less than older generations. There's also the lack of the third space. For our parents and grandparents, their generation, the pub is their third space. Now, with the rise of the gig economy, a more atomized society, the cost of living and social attitudes, the pubs are no longer people's third space. In fact, our generation doesn't really have one. I mean, people are either at work or at home. There's no regular hangout for people anymore. Helena, we hear a lot of people talk about tax, especially pub landlords, but are taxes really their biggest problem?
I mean, I do think the business rates regime probably does need some reform. I like the idea of a tiered business rate system because there are quite a lot of costs associated with setting up even a small business, like a small shop or a small pub or whatever, that makes it very difficult to be part of this. But business rates are only a problem because of how much people have to pay on rent. Now, in terms of pubs, there are a lot of pubs who own their own premises, but a lot of these things will get. A lot of these assets will be bought up by private equity. You look at city centres across this country, huge amounts of money is to be made there, not by actually doing anything, but just by owning the actual real estate within city centres, which is where you'll want to be able to have a profitable business. And to get access to that, you need to essentially pay a tithe on top of whatever else you have in terms of business expense to private equity to be able to exist there in the first place. And business rates are somewhat tied to the value of the property that's there. But if the state owned these premises, if the state owned the city centre real estate that these people need access to be able to set up a business, they would not need to pay twice. They would you wouldn't need business rates. There'll be an income stream from businesses to local authorities in the form of the rent that they pay to be able to have access to these city centre real estate, and your business rates could be slashed massively. I think if we want to talk about a real problem businesses face in this country, it's landlords. Landlords are the problem, because at the very least, money that gets spent on business rates goes back into the coffers for local authorities to be able to spend on public services for everybody. For example, you look at London, and it is an extra windfall from business rates and economic activity in London that's given the funds available for Sadiq Khan to be able to do a massive free school meal rollout in London. That's a good thing. The money that gets spent on real estate in rent for small businesses or whatever, that all gets funneled off into pockets of shareholders, probably off to the Cayman Islands or off into Panama to be able to be used to buy whichever of these shareholders is going to have their extra yacht the next day, the oligarch pockets, right? So I think that trying to blame the state for wanting to find any means with which to raise some sort of revenue for local authorities rather than blaming landlords seems like a bit of a misstep. Do I think that the current government, in lieu of big scale change, should be looking at ways to best be able to facilitate these little pubs to be able to do what they do? Of course, I think that that's true. You know, wanting to make it as economically viable as possible for these third spaces to exist in a country where these things have broadly died because it's a very difficult way of being able to make money, especially when you don't have access to the spaces available because real estate is so expensive. I I think there's probably a happy medium with the situation we've ended up here, and a tiered system seems like a good one to me.
Yeah, I actually thought that the tiered system that Rachel Reeves was looking and looking to bring in, or has brought in, actually is quite a sensible idea. Like, it's in a way a progressive taxation kind of thing. I do think that the government needs to be looking at reducing rates for small businesses, not just pubs, but small businesses generally, because there is a huge monopolization of the economy, as we know, we discuss all the time when it comes to big corporates, and the big giants and the big brands always buy out the competition, and small, medium-sized businesses, especially small businesses, struggle. And I do find it somewhat frustrating when you have, it's usually pub landlords or small business owners always look at the government as they're at fault. They look at the budget and they say they're taxing aspiration or they're taxing me. And it's the same in way in which when people look at income taxes, in which the right wing fundamentally has wrong when they say, we want to reduce your taxes to improve your life. Well, of course, 20% taxes, which is what most of us pay, is really, really small for what you're getting. A bang for your buck deal, given all the public services we have. I know there's issues with it, we know that. But to me, I'm out of pocket when it comes to rent, when it comes to bills and food. And even if my taxes were slashed in half to 10%, that would make zero difference to my life. But if we had rent controls and I was paying 5 to 10% of my wage instead of 50, 60, 70% of my wage on rent, that would make a huge, huge difference. It's, again, kind of a similar conversation we were having last week, but you've got the petite bourgeoisie versus the rentier bourgeoisie, but they're all looking at the government to blame when actually it's the fucking landlords and the commercial rental properties that are destroying small businesses.
An additional point to that, talking about rent controls and housing costs, imagine if we were living in council houses. Imagine if instead of paying rent to private rentier parasite landlords, we were paying money to local authorities to be able to fund public services within our council constituency. That'd be way better, and it would mean they wouldn't have to raise business rates to raise the revenue elsewhere, right? We're paying out huge amounts in housing benefit from the state because landlords are charging people through the nose, when if we actually had these things in public ownership, not only would we not be paying the housing benefit, we'd also be applying more revenue to local authorities. It's a fucked up system, and people are blaming people who've inherited a poorly stratified economy. Again, Labour plays some part to blame because of New Labour accepting Thatcherism in the 90s and 2000s. But at the very least, there needs to be some kind of funding for local authorities given the state of what's happened from after 15 years, right? Like, I don't know if people know this, but I talk about it a lot, but I think it's really worth making sure we have this number committed to memory, that in the 14 years the Conservatives were in power, £15 billion of local authority assets were sold off, probably into the hands of private equity giants, the KKRs and the Blackstones of this world, for them to cream profit off of the top, rather than being locally owned for the community. Like, if you're watching at home, you owned that. That was yours, and it was sold off to pay for local authority deficits, which they now still have because they didn't actually increase their revenue, they just don't have an asset anymore. And that's an absolute travesty. And if we want to fix local authorities, they're going to need more money, whether that's from central government or from higher receipts from council tax and business rates.
Would you like to see, though, because I think I would, the government actually subsidising the pub and third spaces, not just through slashing business rates, for example, but other ways to keep them alive? Because I fundamentally believe in a state that doesn't, and you obviously agree with this as well, not just for numerical value or capital, but for social value too. And I do think the pub, even if you don't drink alcohol, provides a social value. I would be happy for my taxes to be spent on keeping some businesses afloat.
Couldn't see an argument against that. You're right, we do miss third spaces. And if we want to fix social problems, the state is going to have to invest in those things. And it's going to give us a working arrangement that's going to give us the time to do that too. In the situation we have ourselves in the moment, not only do the third spaces not exist, people don't have the time to use them because they're working 3 jobs. They're being incentivized to do a side hustle to make up for the fact that their job doesn't pay enough, which is then also being subsidized by universal credit. This is a myriad problem, and pubs are one part of that, but community centres and libraries and all that kind of stuff is what's important too. Me personally, I go to the pub sometimes, mostly to eat, but when it comes to a third space for congregation, I go to local game stores. You know, the MTG stands for Magic the Gathering. So having more spaces available like this is a really good thing for social cohesion. You know, want to fix a mental health crisis, give people places to meet their friends that don't rely on you spending money. Because we fucking ain't got any of that shit. We don't have any of that. One idea I will say, one thing to finish off, is that I have heard mutterings behind the scenes that trade unions have been thinking about putting money into their own community assets. And I'm just like, Reform have got their own pub. Reform have got a pub where they're using to be able to market themselves. Union pubs.
I love that.